are entering CCNA's studio in STEM City, USA. CCNA is committed to equity in education, social justice, and health.
Hey, good morning. I'm Jim Page. I'm the Executive Director for CCNA, and thank you for joining us this beautiful Saturday morning. We're really blessed today to have a special guest. I'll bring him on in a minute. But let me first say that here in CCNA, we're committed to looking at the issue of mental health in our community, and today's guest is going to amplify that for us. Let me introduce you to my colleague and our mental health consultant, Dr. Andrea Hirsch. Andrea, good morning.
Good morning, Jim. This special presentation is really intended to broaden our understanding and approach to the management of trauma and to encourage a shift in focus more toward healing, empowerment, and well-being. This kind of perspective shift can be incorporated easily into our community institutions, our places of worship, healthcare, work settings, education, and a variety of other organizations to support efforts toward racial, ethnic, and gender-based equity in the systems they serve. It is with pleasure that I introduce Mr. Greg Owens, Racial Equity and Justice Consultant and Trainer. Mr. Owens is a licensed master social worker who has worked for over 34 years with the state of New York. His work focus has been largely on reducing racial disparities in a variety of systems: schools, criminal justice, law enforcement, and local municipalities, to name just a few. Greg is a sought-after trainer and speaker in leadership development, mentoring, cultural competence, and with a special interest in effective approaches to working with young Black males. With his wife, Terry, Greg serves as a deacon, at Macedonia Baptist Church. He has served as a track and field coach, and as I can personally attest, he was an outstanding member of our shared alma mater, Mount Vernon High School track and field team. So we welcome you, Greg, and like to ask you to offer any other tidbits you find I've missed. And please proceed with what's to be a great presentation.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for the kind introduction and the kind words. I guess the only thing that I would add is certainly, like many people from Mount Vernon, New York, I still consider myself a Mount Vernonite, although I have lived in the Capital District in New York since 1988. And so my family is here, in fact, my wife and my daughter, my brother and sister are still in Westchester. And so it's always that connection that keeps me going back to visit and keeps me interested in what's going on at home, Andrea. Thank you so much to Colonel Jim Page and you, Andrea, for the invitation, the gracious invitation to spend this time with you on this beautiful Saturday, and to Jacqueline and Quan for their assistance in helping me to understand more about this particular platform, which I love. It's a wonderful platform. I like what CCNA stands for. The notion of dealing with issues around equity, education, social justice, and health are central to what we ought to be looking at in the world today, in our society today, and for our children, youth, and families. So I'm pleased to be a part of this conversation and look forward to having the conversation with you today. There's a couple of things that I would kind of frame before I began to talk about the specific programs that I want to talk about today. These are two programs that I've become familiar with: the Haven program, which we'll start off with in the last couple of years, and the Healing Centered Engagement program over the last, I would say, 8 to 9 years. And I believe that both of them offer an opportunity for us to further consider what we want to do with regard to health, well-being, and health in its broadest context: emotional health, physical health, psychological health, And healing-centered engagement is, to me, the next thing beyond trauma-informed care and trauma-informed systems. It's not to denigrate anything related to trauma-informed systems and trauma-informed care, but one should always be thinking about what the next best thing is. What should we be concerned about and focusing on in terms of growing into circumstances that are changing, that are ever evolving in today's society, and that children, youth, and families face today, which they may never have had to face during our time growing up. And so it's a pleasure to be with you, to be able to talk about these things. They will be snippets of what are much bigger bodies of work. And I hope that if nothing else, you will be encouraged to take a look at them, and particularly issues that relate to healing around mental health and healing around racial justice. They are so important right now. And if you have further need for further inquiry about that, certainly feel free to reach out. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides with you. So we're going to be talking about the principles of healing to promote community and organizational transformation. And I want to focus on this notion of transformation, because transformation really, to me, fundamentally means a different state of being. All right, that we move from where we are to a different place, a different awareness, a different worldview. And I think in order to get to the outcomes and have the impact that we want to have in the world today, we've got to be less satisfied with making sure that our outcomes are met for the organization's sake, and that our outcomes are met for the funding entity's sake, and really figure out how are we going to help children, youth, and families and communities move from perhaps where they are to where they could be, which is a better sense of self, a better sense of health, a better sense of well-being and safety, and all the things we know are critically important in today's society. So I want to just talk a bit about how we walked into this world of Haven Connects. And this is from, I'd say around 2014 or so, when we hosted a Black Men and Boys Summit in the Capital District. And so the people in this picture, obviously I'm to your far left, and next to me is an associate commissioner for the Department of Health here in Albany, Wilma Alvarado Little, who was working with the Center for the Elimination of Minority Health Disparities at the time, and the health task force that I currently chair. So she and I work together in that capacity. To her, next in line, to her left, is Kenneth Braswell. And you may know him. He's out of Atlanta, and he runs Fathers, Inc., and is doing tremendous work working with fathers around this country and abroad. And so I had the pleasure of working with Ken. We were both here in New York working for the state. He has since blossomed and grown, and Fathers, Inc. is a tremendous organization. I encourage you to look that up, out of Atlanta, if you're trying to do work with fathers. Dr. Sidney Hankerson, who really is the one who approached me about the Haven program, is standing next to Ken. I had the pleasure of meeting him as a part of this summit. He is one of the few Black psychiatrists in the area. And I talk about the area, I'm talking about this portion of New York, and maybe even this segment of the country, quite honestly, because there's a paucity of Black male psychiatrists in the business, period. And so Dr. Hankerson is the one who approached us and approached me about the Haven Connects program. We'll talk a bit more about him as we move forward. And next to him is Dr. Jones, who at that time was the president of the University of Albany and very much a part of our efforts to engage Black males. And just for your information, for those of you who are in the music world or like good music, he happened to have sung with the Sounds of Blackness at one point in time. So very multi-talented person who at this point, when we met, was the president of the University of Albany. And so we were all connected around this work with Black men and boys in the Capital District after coming back from Kentucky, where we were working with people like Sean Dove and others who were great leaders in the work with Black males in this country for over 10 years. And so this is Reverend McCullough, who was one of the key trainers of the Haven Connect program. He is out of Rochester, New York. Next to him is our pastor, and he's our new pastor, our previous pastor of 35 years, retired. And this is Michael Aaron Poindexter, the pastor of Macedonia Baptist Church, where the Haven program is rooted. And he is not only has a master's in divinity, but recently got his master's in social work. And so he and I connect on these issues of community and family, empowerment, justice. And so that's part of the reason why Haven found a program here, because you have to have a progressive mindset. if you're going to invite programs into the faith community that talk about issues that have been difficult for the faith community to talk about, such as mental health, identity, and issues like that. And this is a suicide prevention program. And if you know anything about the church, particularly the Black church, that is not an easy topic for us to talk about. And so we have the leadership of Reverend Michael Aaron Poindexter that helped with getting the program started here. And we're so grateful that he is here to lead us after our pastor, Reverend Comethier, left and retired after 35 years. Next to him is Amita Joshua, one of the key trainers who works at Mount Sinai in the Bronx, who continues to work with us as they develop strategies for the succession of the program, for the continuance of the program into the future. And so it's a real pleasure periodically to connect with Amita after she did the initial training with our youth and with our adults here. And of course, the next person there is myself. And so we're really looking at this notion of mental health and the skyrocketing rates of suicide and acts of suicide, particularly for young people, particularly when you talk about race and ethnicity and gender, young Black males. Those rates have skyrocketed for over a decade now. And this program is an upstream or early effort in the process to help this population begin to look at things differently around their own life and their own circumstances, without specifically and explicitly constantly talking about the clinical issues related to suicide and suicide prevention and mental health. This program begins to look at 4 pillars that talk about well-being in a very different fashion. And so I'm very, very pleased to talk about some of the background that resulted in Haven being considered a program that we want to be involved in. But here's just some quick data. I don't want to use a lot of data today, but this basically supports the notion as to why we're trying to deal in the faith community with Haven. And basically it says very simply, more people initially seek depression care from clergy than psychiatrists, and gives you some of the data that's relevant around that decision or around that issue. And so Haven is actually an acronym, and it stands for Helping to Alleviate Valley Experiences Now. And certainly as we look at what's going on in society, particularly coming out of COVID, and I don't think we're done with COVID or COVID's done with us entirely yet, but I do know that when we were experiencing the lockdowns during COVID, and when young people were not in school and not relating to one another socially as they may have previously, the rates of depression, the rates of anxiety, the rates of stress skyrocketed for young people across the board. And so during that time period, you did see spikes in young people harming themselves. Alcohol and substance abuse spiked, and certainly attempts and efforts to commit suicide also spiked. And so Haven is a suicide prevention developed specifically for Black youth in partnership with churches. It is strength-based. I know we hear that term a lot. We're not really looking at the deficits that communities and families and young people may experience or may have to deal with. We're looking at the strengths that people inherently have as part of the human condition. It builds on natural social networks. We hear a lot about violence in communities and a lot of the negative things that are in community, but there are some natural social networks and natural strengths that people can build upon in the social networks they have within their community. And so this program helps to identify those, helps to highlight those, and helps people to begin to value those in perhaps a different, more meaningful fashion. The folks who are in front of this, Dr. Sherry Mallock, who's actually from your area in the DMV, Peter Wyman, who's a PhD, I believe, out of Rochester, and again, Dr. Sydney Hankerson, a psychiatrist who helped pull this program together. So that, in essence, at its core, is what Haven means, and in essence, what it is, and we'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. Pardon me. There are 4 key principles from the Haven Connect program, and what we ask young people is, are you using these 4 principles that we spent some time teaching you about? And the 4 principles are kinship, purpose, guidance, and balance. And so the program is really focused on young people 12 or so to those who might be considered emerging adults or in their 18, 19, 20-year-old age range. And so we were able to pull these young people together in a small group. There were generally not more than 8, sometimes only 6. And we helped them to take a look at what kinship meant in their lives and how they might be able to use kinship as a way to achieve better well-being, certain focus in their lives, who exactly is in their kinship circles, and how are they relating to those folks. This notion of purpose, which we are all seeking in life, whether we're adults or young people. And so as we ask young people to begin to think about this, what do they think the purpose is that they're on this planet? What do they think they're here to actually do? What is it that they're called to? What is it that they like to do? How do they think that their life has meaning, and what is important to them? The notion of guidance. Who is it that they go to when they have a question? Who is it they talk to when they need advice? Who can they rely upon to give them assistance when this notion of mentorship comes in here? And so we can find out whether or not young people have had mentors and what those mentors may have meant to them, and whether or not they actually need mentors. And then this notion of balance. And balance is so critically important in all of our lives, because as we take a look at the things that make us human, they're in the domains of the physical and the emotional and the spiritual and the mental. And if we don't lose track of those four things, we find ourselves in trouble in terms of what we want, in terms of well-being and peace and harmony in our own lives. And so for young people, particularly in highly stressed communities, in highly stressed circumstances, and in highly stressed times, like with COVID, with other kinds of circumstances that affect young people in communities that are structural in nature, like being unhoused, like poverty, that are maybe more interpersonal or intrapersonal, like violence, and people's inability to really effectively engage one another in a meaningful fashion without harm and without hurt. These are the things that we want to look at as we begin to talk about what balance means to people, right? What is it that's important? What is it that you spend a lot of time doing? What would you like to do that you don't have time to do? How would you begin to find ways to carve time out in a very busy life and very busy schedule and very busy day to do the things that you like to do? And so you'll hear more about this when I talk about the Healing Centered Engagement program and worldview, because I think sometimes we lose track of balance. And I know, I look back in my life, and Andy talked about, running track in high school. That was one thing among many things that I was involved in. And I'm the kind of person who likes to be involved in a lot of things, probably up until the last couple of years, when I began to appreciate the need to have a balance between being busy and being more reflective, a balance between resting and being in the grind. And so we've heard so much over the last couple of decades about being in the grind and getting it done and working for extended periods of time and longer hours during the day, sometimes sacrificing relationships, sometimes sacrificing our own health and well-being. And young people are engaged in the same kind of struggle, the same kind of challenge, as they are asked to go to school and be involved in various activities and be a peer and be a sibling and be a child. And so how do we help young people balance that so that they are able to find places in very busy lives where they can pause, where they can think, where they can breathe, and where they can pursue what we would like to think is a better circumstance, rather than constantly being busy, because we are trained and rewarded for what we think is important, and that is trying to be busy. So as I said, with Haven, they were developing partnerships with Black churches. In the state of New York, they were looking at 12 churches. Macedonia was one of the early innovators in the program. And the purpose of that, again, some of the research supports that the church is an excellent venue for promoting positive mental health among Black Americans, because it's an influential institution within the African American or Black community. And this is 2010 data. So this is not terribly outdated. And the institution of the church, while it may not appear to be as strong as it once was, it is still considered an influential institution. And of course, 87% of Black Americans are affiliated with church, and over 60% of Black youth attend church regularly. And that's from a 2009 Pew Foundation report. And I think that's interesting to note, because the narrative, based upon what we think we see or perception, is that people are failing or falling out of going to church, or failing to see the value of church. And I think these numbers may confound that notion just a bit. Youth Connect training focuses on core strengths in core protective areas that I just mentioned. And it attempts to strengthen the skills and grow and sustain the things that we need to do around these issues of kinship, guidance, purpose, and balance. And so again, healthy bonds for family, friends, church, and community. How do we help young people begin to discover those? How do we get support for young people from mentors and access to medical and mental health expertise? What are their goals and values and sense of belonging? And what does self-care and support mean to young people? Jim, I see you're in the room with a comment or a question.
Yeah, I do. I didn't mean to. Greg, can you talk very briefly then about the effect of COVID on your work? You've mentioned it very briefly before. Has that made it more difficult for you and what you're doing?
I think COVID has compromised almost everything, Jim. And so it certainly has made it more challenging. And there's actually, kind of a new perspective on COVID and long lasting effects on that around people's emotional and mental health. There's this post-traumatic COVID circumstance that's being talked about now. And there's this notion of, it's called FOGO, fear of going out.
Right.
And so there's people who used to go to places that don't go there anymore. There are young people who used to be involved in activities that don't come out and do that. So you end up having to reach them virtually, which is not optimal. And then, of course, there's that need to really engage with young people in a more proximate fashion, a closer up, because, quite honestly, when you're tactile, when you can hug and touch, there's a chemical that's released that adds to our well-being and our sense of connectedness. And I think we missed all of that during COVID. And so the isolation that young people felt, the stresses that young people felt, just by being in contact, we missed the opportunity to help them mitigate that. So a long answer to the question, Jim, I think COVID really compromised all of our efforts to try and do this in a more meaningful fashion. I think we're trying to catch up now.
Yeah, I don't want to take you off track, but before we close, I'd like to come back to that and talk about what we can do post-COVID and some of the tips you could share with us. So I'll go back to you.
Sounds good, Jim. Thank you. So in summary, Haven is an upstream suicide prevention program for young people that operates out of the faith-based community. It is focused on the spiraling and spiking rates of Black male suicide. And so the Black church is a target or an area of focus for the program. There are 3 sessions for young people that helps them go through those 4 pillars that I mentioned earlier on. And there is 1 session for adults who can then help young people after those 3 training sessions to begin to integrate the program, perhaps into Vacation Bible School, which we've got coming up next month, into the regular kinds of activities that go on in church, like Sunday school or youth fellowship. So it's focused on reducing mental health inequities, and it requires multi-level interventions. And we want to make sure that we pay specific attention to the structural issues around race or structural racism as we help particularly young Black males, but people of color who are impacted by racism, to help them begin to understand how this impacts on their well-being and their life circumstances. Community engaged research is a part of this. We want to make sure the community is working with the program around any research that happens, and particularly as we look at evidence-based treatments that may come as a result of this. Church-based interventions can really have a broader reach, as you saw the data on who attends church, particularly in the African-American or Black community, and young people, 60% of whom in 2009 were still affiliated with and attending churches. So Haven Connect is a way for young people who are dealing with life stressors that may cause them to make a permanent decision about a transient circumstance, that we can help them avoid making that kind of decision. So I want to move on and get to healing-centered engagement and speak a bit about that, and certainly want to leave enough time for questions about any of this, and certainly encourage you to put your questions up for us to deal with. And there are those who are monitoring that can certainly interrupt, and we can take questions during the course of the presentation. And so we spent a lot of time in the early 2000s talking about youth development. And then shortly after that, we spent a lot of time talking about resilience. And in the last decade or so, we moved into the conversation about trauma, trauma-informed care, and training people to have trauma-informed systems. And so youth development was based upon these factors that youth may have access to that can help them in their development. But the question then becomes, well, what happens if you live in circumstances where you don't have the same access to all of those factors that may help you develop into the young person that you want to be? What happens in communities where poverty is such an overwhelming situation that you don't have the opportunity to know what it's like to have enough to eat? to have enough access to things. So youth development has a place. And then beyond that, what's the next thing we need to be thinking about in marginalized communities where there is no access to the kind of developmental factors that other communities may have access to? We talked a lot about this notion of resilience and how you build the capacity to withstand. But in the last years that I've been doing this work, and I'm talking about probably the last decade and a half, I've heard experts talk about resilience in a very different fashion. Some of the experts talk about resilience as suffering with nobility. And so the notion of resilience, meaning that we want you to build the capacity to withstand because we're not able or not willing or not capable of undoing the structural issues that are causing you to be in your circumstance, is like asking people to suffer with nobility. And so I don't think we want to settle for asking people to just be resilient. So I think that we want to move beyond resilience and take a look at what's next. And so trauma-informed care was the next thing. But trauma-informed care was very much a clinical orientation, and we want to talk about why we want to move beyond trauma. I see a question, and I'm going to try and address that. Is there a mental health crisis among Black students? And if so, what can we do about it? I think there is a mental health crisis among Black students. I think that the structural and institutional issues around racism and racialized engagement have caused Black students to experience problems with mental health, spiritual health, emotional health, and being treated inequitably. And so I think what we want to do is focus on those factors that have always kept us, such as the institutions like making our schools more responsive and more family friendly and more community friendly, making sure that families have the structural things they need to make sure that young people who attend school are attending school with the things that they need to be successful and to be healthy and to be well. And I think that we also need to focus on this notion of healing and not settle for the individual acts that look like people are okay when in fact they are going back home into communities where the trauma is unrelenting and never lets up. And so I want to talk some more about that because that was a real salient question. And I hope that's part of what we get to in the healing-centered engagement portion of this will help to answer that question. I think we need to focus on issues related to structural racism and not be afraid to tell young people of color, particularly the question was around Black students, what history has done to us, what circumstance has done to us, and how to structurally and strategically begin to mitigate those circumstances and not buy into the notion that there's nothing you can do and develop a nihilist mindset about that results in harming other people or self-harm. Healing-centered engagement is strength-based. It's a collective view of healing as opposed to an individual one, and it recenters culture as a central focus on well-being. Culture is critically important to healing-centered engagement. As opposed to trauma-informed care, it's holistic, again, involves culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. There's a notion in the body of work around healing that taking civic action is part of healing. It views trauma not just as an individual isolated experience, but rather highlights the ways in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively. Culturally, communities of color tend to focus on the collective. And so we don't want an intervention that focuses on individual circumstances when the trauma that's being experienced is being experienced in the collective. What happened with the murder of George Floyd did not just harm people who were closest to George Floyd, closest in terms of members of his family, even those who lived in Minnesota. It had an impact on the collective where all of us were shaken by that. And so the intervention or the strategy to address that can't be at the individual level. And it expands how we think about responses to trauma and offers a more holistic approach to fostering well-being. We have a question out of Greensboro. What are some of the legal and ethical aspects of mental health care? I'm not a mental health expert. And so I would defer that to someone who has greater expertise in the legal and ethical aspects of mental care, to our friend out of Greensboro, North Carolina. What is the value of crisis intervention teams? I think that's very situational. I think there is a place for crisis intervention teams. I think that there are times when the crisis is not necessarily related to a legal circumstance where law enforcement or police have to be involved, and yet that sometimes tends to be the default. Well, when we see people acting differently in communities, when they appear to be acting in a way that's unsafe to them, to themselves, or to their families, or to the environment. And so I think that if you have teams of mental health specialists, or people who can go in, diffuse a situation, and provide the proper care that's not necessarily based on law enforcement or police intervention, but is based upon caring and healing and mental health circumstances, I think that's the most appropriate place for crisis intervention. Healing-centered engagement has these 4 domains that we want to at least think about, because it really is a shift in our worldview and an opportunity for us to really begin to look at healing in a different fashion. It's really political with a small p rather than clinical. Again, it's asset-driven and focuses on well-being. It's culturally grounded and supports those of us who are in this part of the continuum who want to do well and want to provide services. It supports us with our own healing. And if you look over the course of your lifetimes, and I've been in the business for 40 years prior to retiring a couple of years ago, I have had to implement policies, practices, regulations that were harmful to children, youth, and families. And so you hear a lot now about the abolishment, rather, of the child welfare system, because it does not seem to be able to stop its over-monitoring of communities of color and the harm it's doing to young families in communities of color. You see a conversation about the abolition of the justice system, because it does not seem to be equitable, and there seems to be racism as well as gender issues that impact differentially depending upon whether you're a person of color or identify as a female or non-binary person. And so there is that part of the continuum that talks about getting rid of those systems. And then there are others who are doing the work of reforming them. Those of us who are working to do our very best and still inadvertently cause harm because of long-standing policies, practices, rules, and regulation, we too need to engage in our own healing. If we don't, we run the risk of continuing to promote some of the racism that occurs within our systems, some of the patriarchy that occurs within our systems, and that is simply heaping harm upon harm to the children, youth, and families that we say we are coming to work for every day. Dr. Sean Ginwright, who is the CEO and founder of Flourish Agenda, is the person who credentialed me and as a practitioner in healing-centered engagement shortly after I retired. And so Dr. Ginwright's work basically aligns institutions with this perspective and approach and strategy to address harm, restore well-being, and shift systems from harm, discipline, and punishment and confinement to systems that can restore, that can bring hope, and can bring healing. Jim, I see you're back in the room.
Yes, sir. A couple of things. One, administratively, we've got several questions that came in before we started, which may not be in your bailiwick, but I'm still going to share them with you later as we leave, if you don't mind.
Very good.
Could you give me about 30 seconds on your definition of structural racism, what it really means to you?
Sure, Jim. Structural racism is the manifestation of the denial of scarce resources based upon power, privilege, and prestige that is driven by color that operates across various systems in this country and beyond. And so it is different from individual racism. It is different from institutional racism, which operates within the silos of various institutions. This is the foundation upon which institutions are built. And so it's the very structures that cause our society to exist. And so rather than looking at a school system and looking at the institutional racism that may exist there, the question then becomes, well, why is housing putting people in a position where they have to go to that particular school? Why is poverty causing that school not to be equitably treated in terms of school financing? Why doesn't that school have the same resources as others in terms of the very formula it uses to fund? That's a structural view as opposed to an institutional view.
Right.
I hope that makes sense, Jim.
It does. So you're looking at city planning and housing and transportation structure in the city, where it starts with the need for mental health care. I got you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mental health care tends to operate at the individual and interpersonal and institutional level. If you're not careful, you miss all those issues you talked about because it's exacerbated by poverty, by lack of housing, and by decisions that are causing people to be placed in space that go back to the 1940s in terms of decisions around who would live in what are called urban communities and who had access to living outside of urban communities and what that meant.
Don't let me take you off track, Greg. Go back to you. I got another question. I'll come back to you in a minute.
Okay, sounds good. So the difference between PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and PTSE, which is persistent traumatic stress experience or environment, is found here. And so PTSD was basically a military focus. It presumes that trauma is episodic. And so clinical approaches were applied to addressing the trauma, and sometimes it was focused on reducing symptoms. PTSD presumes that there are people who live in communities and have life circumstances where trauma and stress is never ending. It's like a car that is constantly revving. And you know what happens to the engine if the car is constantly revving. So it's focused on clients, community, and those of us who are considered providers. It knows that trauma in some communities is never ending because of social toxins. It's probably more political and cultural in its focus than clinical. And again, it presumes that those of us who are in this part of the continuum who are providing help need to be healing also. It talks about the 3 levels of this ecosystem of harm. And so harm happens at the individual level. It happens between individuals or in the interpersonal level. And most importantly and critically, in my opinion, it happens at the institutional and structural level where policies, practices, laws, rules, and regulations continue to promote the inequity that we find in this ecosystem of harm. The social toxins are ones that we're real familiar with, and they're listed before you, and there's probably some others that are not listed here, but we run through them just like the people we say we come to work run through them every day, breathing them in, affected by them, they're raining on us. We seem to think sometimes that it's only the people we come to work for who get wet. It's these social toxins are raining down on us also. Hence the premise that's fundamental to healing-centered engagement. Those of us who are providers, those of us who are trying to do the right thing every day, we too need to heal. And there are some insidious social toxins that we don't often talk about, but they are real. And particularly during COVID, you saw how heinous they were in terms of how they affected particularly children and youth and families in communities that are already under-resourced. And so if you can imagine what it's like to live with uncertainty 24/7, what it's like to be fearful 24/7, what anxiety feels like when you carry it around 24/7, and this notion of shame, which I had the pleasure of working in the Bronx Family Court under Judge Gail Roberts for a moment, and would do some training there with her staff. And I introduced this topic. People were a little bit anxious about it. They said, no, I've never heard about shame. And shame and worry are the predecessors to anger. Most of our recommendations around dealing with young people who come in contact with the systems and their parents in particular is that they need to engage in some sort of anger management program. But there's never a program, never an approach to deal with these other factors that are insidious toxins. And so we need to begin to think about those differently and how we might begin to help people mitigate, manage, and then ultimately heal from those. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this continuum, but in essence, in short, we need to move from a place of suffering to a place of thriving. We need to move from a place of persistent conditions of injustice to conditions of optimal justice. And so this is the continuum that we need to move towards in terms of the psychosocial processes that we engage in and along this justice continuum. And so as you take a look at the work of Dr. Sean Ginwright and the folks of Flourish Agenda, you'll find more about this. This is, I think, pretty important for those of us who are trying to do this work to understand. There are specific conditions for systems change. And again, this comes out of the Healing Centered Engagement work, Dr. Ginwright's. And so we want to ask a couple of questions about the events. So the question is, what happened? We were talking a little bit earlier about the situation in subways in New York City, the horrible ending to that situation. So we need to, again, peel back the layers and figure out exactly what happened. And then we need to find out what trends have happened over the course of time. What are the patterns that have occurred that may have contributed to this particular event? And then again, as Jim has asked, what are the structural concerns that exist that we may not be paying attention to or don't feel that we can mitigate or undo? So what influenced the particular pattern that's structural in nature and maybe long-standing? And to me, one of the more important pieces is, what do people think? What are their beliefs? What are their values? What are their biases? What are their mental models that may have contributed to this ongoing and persistent stress that people live in? What do people think about folks who live in that particular zip code? What are they hearing about folks who come from this particular group? How are they then processing those in terms of seeking equity and fairness and justice? Or do they believe that their mental models, their implicit and unconscious biases don't have any impact on that? And there's too much research and too much literature that says our mental models, even when they're not readily accessible to us because they operate in the unconscious, still have profound impact because they better predict behavior than those things which we more explicitly express about the way we feel about people, places, and things. So there are 4 pivots that I want to share with you about this particular framework, right? Dr. Jenright has said in the literature that he is promoting, he's by the way, a psychologist and professor of Africana Studies at a school in the West Coast. So he says we need to move from the lens to the mirror. What are we talking about here? We are trained to look out, to look at other people, to look at other circumstances, to look away from ourselves. Basic social work practice says you really need to start with the other, but this challenges that. This says that before you come to work each day, you need to figure out who you need to be that day, to look in the mirror first and figure out who you want to be that day. So the work of the mirror is reflective work. It requires us to slow down and ask ourselves some questions before we begin to go and interact and interface with others. It is hard work because the mirror can be unrelenting. It will tend to tell you the truth about what you're looking at. But that's the work we want to start with. We want to move from looking out and start looking in first. We need to move our relationships and our organizations from being transactional to more transformative. What are we talking about? Transactional relationships are a business model. It's a give and take model. And so what's really important for us to begin to figure out is how we move from that traditional standard model of don't give unless you can get something back to moving into something that's really transformative that says, you know, I'm going to give even if I don't get anything back. I'm going to give not expecting anything back. It changes the rules of the game. So our funding shifts, our engagement shifts, etc. I'm going to get to the question about tips for churches in just a second. We need to move from focusing so much on solving problems, which we're rewarded for and trained to do and expected to do very well. So I understand that. But when do we begin to think about possibilities? When do we begin to think bigger than the problem? When do we begin to ask ourselves, what would this be like if it was at its optimal best? We can get hung up in the budget. We can get hung up in all sorts of things that can stop us from achieving what we want to. But if we intend to heal, we got to think about possibilities. And we are addicted to being busy. We need to move from this notion of being busy all the time and being rewarded for that to finding a way to be more reflective and self-reflective, slowing things down, and finding a place where we can actually think and feel about the work that we're trying to do. So this question that's here now is tips for churches to address mental health issues. Good question. That's from Alexandria, Virginia. So let me talk about what Haven required us to do real quickly. Haven asked for the pastor of our church to include mental health circumstances and issues and even conversations about suicide from the pulpit. So you got to have leadership in the church, the pastor who is able to say with a level of comfort from the pulpit these issues around mental health and being able to encourage people to seek mental health, just like he or she may encourage them to seek help around their spiritual needs. Churches can begin to integrate a conversation about mental health in the ongoing regularized activities of the church. And so if you have ministries that meet, particularly if you have a health ministry, bringing in people from the outside to talk about mental health, just like we talk about anything else in church, becomes a way for churches to begin to make this a regular and normal part of what they do within the church and within the congregation. And partnering with programs that provide mental health services is critically important. We are a partner with the University of Albany Center for the Elimination of Minority Health Disparities, and mental health is a key portion of that. And so when we need help, we need assistance, we ask for assistance from one of our partners. So churches developing real partnerships with the mental health community is another way for them to begin to move to healing around mental health issues within the context of the church community. So I hope that was helpful. And I'm going to wind down in a couple of minutes here because I want to leave time for some more Q&A. But here's some thoughts about moving from a lens to a mirror. Just for your consideration. One is internal, One is external. One's used to study and examine. The other is used to be more honest and reflect us back what we really need to see about who we want to be. Transactional focus is one that says we give and take. We're going to maintain the status quo, the policies and practices that exist. We're going to keep those. We don't want to make structural changes, particularly around the achievement of racial, ethnic, and gender equity. We're going to keep things just as they are because they seem like they're working pretty well. The question is, working well for who? Transformative organizations have to do with being more creative and supporting new policies and practices, changing the climate norms and then changing the cultural norms, and making sure that there's an explicit focus on dealing with issues that are barriers to achieving equity, fairness, justice for racial, ethnic, and gender people who are not experiencing equity in the context of working in their spaces and places. Moving from problem to possibility requires clarity. There's this notion of being proximate, which is up close and personal, and then being able to step back and gaining a perspective. These are two different things. And so the data makes us be proximate. We need to get close with that. But when we step back, we can see the bigger picture, get the bird's eye view, and begin to maybe see things a bit differently. We need to be able to move with fluidity from being proximate to being perspective oriented. I'm going to move past this quickly here. Finding flow is actually ancient. You read about this with all ancient cultures who actually begin to find the time to rest. This particular culture is one where rest is discouraged, where if you don't look like you're busy, it looks like you're not really adding value. And if you take a look at that second bullet, that ought to frighten us. Because if children by the age of 8 have already developed a dysfunctional attitude towards sleep and rest, we know what happens when they move on to be adults. So out of Sarasota, Florida, the impact of social media on mental health care. I think social media has an impact on all of our care and our well-being. And so I think there's an overabundance of use of social media. And I think social media, along with media in general, is one of the places that forms our worldview and one of the places that is fodder for our biases. So I think we have to be careful around social media, and we particularly have to be careful with young people's consumption of social media because it's contributing to a view of the world that is not at all healthy, that is biased, and that shows them in a certain fashion that can contribute to a negative feeling about themselves and their circumstances. Jim, I see you've joined us again.
Yeah, quick question for you. Greg, we've got about 9 minutes left. I want to be mindful of your time. But could you talk very briefly about the aging population and the work you're doing to look at specifically the aging population?
The aging population.
Correct.
So the aging population is one of the two populations that experience the greatest bias in this country. People who are getting older and people who don't fit a certain body type. Those are the two groups of people that experience tremendous bias, not just in American society, but around the world. And so we sometimes forget that there is dementia, Alzheimer, isolation, depression that impacts the aging population because as people leave their lives and move on and children move out and family moves away, older people find themselves isolated if they're not connected. And certainly connection and relationships are what we talked about early on as being important for young people. I think they're equally important for those in the aging population. So we need to make sure we pay attention. We need to make sure we help them stay connected. We need to check in on mental health just like we would on physical health. And I think we need to make sure that we lift them up in terms of any program focus and not make them kind of a secondary offshoot of the work that we're trying to do while we work with other populations.
So when you look at the generational differences, you take a look at the different layers of aging and Gen Z versus Gen X, those kind of things. Do you look at that?
Well, I think that's important to consider. There are some folks who think that kind of is it a bit of a distraction. I think that you've got to take a look at what is happening through the life cycle, right? Because there are people who are in their 40s and 50s who deal with the world differently than those of us who are in our 60s and 70s, who deal differently with the world than those of us who are octogenarians and beyond. Just had someone who's 102 years old go on to glory from our family population here in church. That person's experience as 102 years old is something that we need to be paying attention to make sure that mental health, physical health, spiritual health, and all the things we think are important are just as important at 102 as they were when they were in their 40s and 50s.
Okay. Let me get back to you just with the presentation. Greg, please.
Okay, I'm going to kind of move through this quickly because we're winding down. So if we expect laws and rules and regulations to be the only thing that takes care of this issue of healing from this ongoing and persistent trauma, I think what Howard Thurman has said here has some relevance for us. They're limited because they can only establish the climate for fellowship. They're limited in that they cannot guarantee the spiritual and moral requisites of community. This work has to happen over time. There's got to be moral practices that cultivate a climate of grace and compassion. Without this, we're building symbols of a great society. Without this, we're engaged in transactional and not transformative relationships. Without this, we continue to promulgate harm as opposed to healing. Without this, people who are marginalized continue to be even more marginalized. We can't rely upon more rules and regulations to resolve these issues. We've got to have a different worldview. And the worldview that I've just promoted, that of healing and centering healing, is one that I would hope we would take some consideration and think about and talk about some more. Dr. Ginwright has said, if we can move between accountability and grace, then we can collectively humanize one another. This is Gregory Hines, and we don't have time to watch him now, but I usually end this presentation by watching the late great Gregory Hines dance, because he's a favorite of mine. He's one of the early hoofers, and I have had a great affinity for his multi-talented abilities. But what he does is move from form to form during his tap dance number. And I think what I'd like you to consider is how we move from transaction to transformation. How do we move from problem solving to talking about and creating possibilities? How do we move from being addicted to being busy, which also has a racialized component to it? Because if you look at the history of America, there are some folks who had to work from can't see in the morning till can't see at night and still were considered lazy. And that does not end at the end, in 1865. There are still people who are considered not worthy of rest because of their race, because of their gender, because of other identity factors. And so we've got to begin to think about this a bit differently and begin to shift our worldview just enough to be able to be accountable. So this doesn't mean that we can't have some transactional relationships, expect some transactional business to occur. But when can we get to the point where we can be more transformative and begin to have a conversation about what it would look like at its optimal best? And that's when grace can step in and allow us to really humanize one another and not treat one another like we're automatons, but really fully human beings, so that we can heal together as a community and collectively from this ongoing trauma, which, my friends, is only going to grow given what I see on the social and political and cultural scale, not just in America, but around the world. And so I'm going to end with that, and I'm going to ask if there's any questions and comments for the last few minutes here, because this is a much broader presentation. I wanted to give you just a taste of Haven and healing-centered engagement, and hopefully encourage you to begin your own inquiry around these bodies of work. So are there any questions that I might address or attend to at this point?
Greg, thank you so much. We've got several questions. I'm just going to read a few that I have in front of me from an earlier email. Mm-hmm. The first one has to do with, are there any best practices around the country, around the world, that you'd want to share with us?
Best practices related to
intervention and addressing mental health, especially for the underserved population?
I think there are some promising practices and best practices, and I think that what I consider to be best practice would fall into the realm of this world of healing. Okay. And that includes this notion of involving people in the process and not alienating people, becoming more educated about the significance of culture and all of its dimensions. And so, culture, we tend to deal with culture with that 8% or 10% that's above the metaphorical waterline, what we see and feel and touch and taste, and therefore think we know. But most of culture, Jim, as you well know, is below that waterline. Right. 90+% is what we don't see. So values and beliefs and significant events. If we pay more attention to those things, we can better begin to understand why people walk through this world and how they walk through this world. And then I think that there are some people in communities who are natural healers, who we can tap into and help them to become even better at what they do. They may not be clinicians, they may not have all the initials behind their name, but they know how to help a child and a family heal. And so I think there's a need to be more collaborative with people, value community even more, become more astute about the resources that are in the community, and rather than cause the institutions to grow by funneling all the money to the institution and to the system, redirect the resources into the community where there's children, youth, and families who can
Right.
immediately benefit from them and not have to go through this arcane dance of waiting for the system to provide what they need.
Andrea, you had something?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, Greg, a little bit about your experience or advice in bringing these principles or concepts into police and other safety, quotes, organizations.
Good question, Andrea. So my experience in working with law enforcement has been around training in unconscious bias and the mind science of bias. And by and large, when I first began to do that training, it was not well received. And you can understand, I'm not part of that tribe, if you will. I'm not in law enforcement. And that's a very kind of collective community that doesn't necessarily operate in a very open fashion. There was suspicion as to why I was really there. So it took some time to overcome that. So I think you have to be persistent. You have to be present. You have to be knowledgeable. And I think you have to find individuals who can help you lead the conversation, who value what we're talking about here. And so there are people who are in law enforcement and police organizations who are aligned with this mindset. We've got to find them and help them lift this up within the police and law enforcement community, because if we're external to it, we're not going to be able to have the same kind of relationships and be heard the same way. So I would find those folks where you can get some traction and begin to help them grow their capacity.
Ray, can you talk very briefly then about the intersection of race and mental health training? And I said it in the context of here at CCNA, we're looking very heavily at mental health first aid. What does that mean, and how do you address that? Any thoughts on that?
I think that race is a salient factor. I think that we need to have more coalitions of color. I think if you're going to engage with people of color around issues that are very sensitive around mental health, emotional health, etc., that you've got to have people who have relationship with them. And I think that folks who are clinicians of color, professionals of color, we need to grow that capacity and grow that number. I do think people have to understand structural and institutional racism in order to do this work. If you don't understand that, we're going to miss what racism has done to harm people, and therefore won't be able to provide the kind of interventions that include cultural considerations and race as a salient and relevant factor.
Greg, where do we find the next generation of mental health providers, minority mental health providers?
I think they're there. I have a nephew who's now a clinical psychologist. His parents were clinical psychologists, so my sister and my brother-in-law. I think they are there. I think what we've got to do is find ways to value them, just like in the social work profession. So we got to pay them. We've got to put them in positions where there's opportunities to grow. We've got to recognize their voice when they're at the table. And I think we've got to help them to do what they do best and not what the organization needs for them to do solely.
Greg, coming in July is Minority Mental Health Month. Can we circle back and talk a little bit more about finding the next generation of clinicians? Would you be willing to be part of that conversation?
I certainly will be happy to talk with you about it, Jim.
Yeah. We're about out of time, and I wanted to make sure that I say thank you personally for spending time with us. We talked about your resume as advertised. Thank you so very much. Any words of wisdom before we leave?
I would certainly want to thank you for having me. I think that a couple of points I would want you to think about. How are young people experiencing health and mental health in your communities? Do you know that? And if you don't, find out. How do people experience healing in our communities? Have we talked to them about healing? Is healing a valued thing to talk about? Or do people think it's just about someone else who engages in healing in a very specific and strict fashion? I think if we can make this a regular part of our ongoing conversation, people can get a better appreciation for the fact that if I'm still not healed, then I'm probably still engaged in harmful interactions with people.
Greg, thank you so much. We're about out of time. Going to call you again. So stand by. Appreciate you, sir.
It's a pleasure, Jim. You take good care. And once again, thank you.